There are nights when the desert itself seems to whisper, when the moonlight clings like incense to the stone faces of temples long buried in sand. If you stand in the hush of that eternal silence, and if you listen carefully, you might almost hear it, the faint whisper of hair moving beneath a linen veil, the rustle of papyrus recording laws older than memory. In ancient Egypt, even the smallest strand of hair was not left to chance. To the Egyptians, the body was a vessel not only of life but of divine order, a miniature cosmos that must mirror the harmony of the gods. Hair, being alive, unruly, and untamed, stood at the delicate border between nature and civilization, purity and chaos. It was a reminder that beneath all ceremony, beneath all divine law, there still lived the wilderness of the human self. And so, it had to be governed. In the age of pyramids and lotus crowns, the hair upon one's head was no trivial ornament. It was bound by custom, regulated by priests, dictated by class and by season. To the untrained eye, the Egypt of dynasties appears a world of gold and sand, pharaohs glittering under the sun, their wigs perfect and unchanging. But beneath that perfection was a quiet tyranny of ritual, a system of purity so precise that even the growth of a child's first hair or the shaving of a priest's scalp was a matter of cosmic law. Imagine, then, the gentle hum of the Nile at twilight, the water glinting like molten bronze. Along its banks, women kneel to wash their hair in sacred oils, their movements slow and deliberate, repeating gestures that have been taught for centuries. They use combs of ivory and ebony, their teeth worn smooth from years of use. The scent of castor oil mingles with that of frankincense, drifting upward to join the chorus of evening birds. In the distance, temple bells sound, soft, rhythmic, eternal. Within the inner sanctum of the temple, priests prepare for purification. Their heads are shaved not as a mark of humility, but of authority, for to be clean-shaven was to reject the chaos of the wild and to accept the discipline of the gods. The razor's edge was sacred. To cut hair was to cut away the impurity of the flesh, to make oneself a vessel fit for ritual. There was an order to it, certain days, certain tools, certain prayers. The blade was often made of copper, polished to a soft gleam, and before it touched the skin, a priest would whisper a spell invoking the goddess of cleanliness, for even the act of shaving was a ceremony, a reaffirmation that the human form was not its own, but a reflection of the divine geometry that held the world in balance. Yet this devotion to purity was not merely a matter of faith. It was a law, enforced, recorded, and sustained through centuries. The ancient Egyptian legal system, entwined with religion, dictated that certain professions, certain ranks, and even certain moments in life demanded a precise treatment of hair. A priest caught with hair growth beyond a prescribed length could be punished. A mourner who failed to dishevel her hair at a funeral might be judged impious. Even children were subject to the pattern, the side lock of youth, that singular curl left upon a shaven scalp, marking them as beloved of Horus. When the time came for the lock to be cut, the ceremony would be observed with offerings and chants, for hair was not discarded lightly. It carried with it a trace of the person's essence, the ka, the vital spirit, and thus, every strand had to be treated with reverence or burned to release its charge. Archaeologists have found bundles of hair wrapped in linen, buried with care beside the dead. Some belong to the deceased, others to loved ones left behind. In both cases, they were offerings, connections between worlds, fibers tying life to eternity. As we move deeper into this story, we begin to realize that in ancient Egypt, the human head was not merely the seat of thought but the stage upon which identity itself was performed. The choice between a shaven scalp and a cascade of braids was not personal fashion, it was the language of power. Pharaohs, nobles, and commoners alike wore wigs of extraordinary craftsmanship. These were not disguises but declarations. Each lock of hair was placed according to code, a symbol of status, gender, divinity, and role. Wigs were woven with precision, sometimes from human hair, sometimes from the fibers of palm and rush, sometimes a mixture of both, but always bound together with ritual oils that ensured not only their longevity but their sanctity. For to wear hair not one's own was to participate in a kind of transformation. The wearer became more than themselves, they became an image of order, of Mot, that delicate balance between chaos and harmony that governed every aspect of Egyptian thought. In time, the laws surrounding wigs became as intricate as those governing tombs. Certain temples kept detailed records of wig production, assigning artisans to create specific types for ceremonies and burial rites. These artisans were trained in silence and patience, often working by lamplight for days to perfect the curve of a braid or the fall of a fringe. The wigs themselves were sometimes perfumed with lotus oil and sealed in boxes carved with protective spells. When a noble died, their burial wig was as carefully chosen as their jewelry. It represented how they wished to appear in eternity, youthful, divine, untouched by decay. In the tomb paintings of the New Kingdom, the dead are shown wearing their finest wigs even in the presence of gods. The implication is clear: to appear before the divine without proper adornment would be unthinkable. Cleanliness, symmetry, and control, these were not mere aesthetics. They were the outward manifestation of spiritual discipline. Yet, beneath this perfection, a subtle unease lingers. For all their devotion to purity, the Egyptians were also haunted by the power of what they sought to control. Hair was both sacred and dangerous, a living thing that could hold the self captive if mishandled. Magical texts warn of sorcery performed with locks of hair, of curses woven into braids, of love spells enacted through strands stolen in secret. In this, we glimpse the paradox at the heart of Egyptian order. The same hair that symbolized divine beauty could also be a conduit for dark enchantment. This fear bred respect, and that respect became rule. One did not cut hair casually, nor did one touch another's head without permission. Even barbers were often trained under priestly supervision, bound by oaths to perform their craft without malevolence. The act of hair care, so intimate, was also perilous, for to mishandle it was to risk disturbing the unseen energies that linked body and soul. If you were to wander through the market of Thebes at midday, you might find a wigmaker seated beneath a canopy, surrounded by bundles of hair sorted by shade and texture. The air would smell faintly of beeswax and myrrh. He would speak softly, measuring each head with practiced eye, knowing which pattern suited which station. A laborer might wear a short, plain wig of woven fiber, a noblewoman, a cascading arrangement of black curls that shimmered like river water. The price would not be merely in silver but in favor, for a wig was a passport to respectability. Without it, one might appear impure, unkempt, uncivilized. Even the statues of gods were adorned with wigs, their strands carved in perfect symmetry, their curls frozen in eternal order. The sculptors who rendered them knew well that to shape hair was to shape divinity itself. And so, hair became a bridge, between the mortal and the divine, between the chaos of nature and the geometry of heaven. As night descends upon the ancient city, one might imagine the quiet chambers where priests prepare for dawn. The razors lie in their bronze trays, gleaming faintly in the torchlight. The scent of natron and cedar fills the air. Each man moves in silence, shaving not just the head but the entire body, leaving no trace of hair to disturb the purity of ritual. The process is slow, rhythmic, like a meditation. With every stroke, the self is pared away, leaving only the vessel of service. When the first light of RA touches the horizon, they are ready, clean, fragrant, precise. To stand before the gods, they must be as flawless as the stone carvings that surround them. In the stillness of that dawn, the boundary between life and ritual dissolves. The shaven skin gleams like alabaster, the air hums with invisible order. Every hair that falls to the ground is a silent offering, a reminder that perfection is not natural, but achieved through devotion, discipline, and control. And perhaps that is the secret of Egyptian beauty, not the abundance of gold or the perfection of form, but the will to impose harmony upon the living chaos of flesh. In their eyes, every aspect of the body was an echo of cosmic law, and hair, ever restless, ever growing, was a small rebellion against eternity. To govern it was to reaffirm that the gods had not withdrawn, that Mot still held sway. Even now, thousands of years later, as we gaze upon the black wigs preserved in tombs, their curls still gleaming with ancient oil, we feel a strange unease. They seem alive, as though waiting for their owners to return. And perhaps, in some forgotten way, they are. For in ancient Egypt, hair was never just hair. It was the thread that bound life to the divine, order to chaos, the seen to the unseen. And if you listen closely, even across the centuries, you may still hear it, the whisper of a comb through unseen strands, the echo of a law written not upon stone, but upon the body itself. To understand the laws that govern the human body in ancient Egypt, one must begin not with the temples or the tombs, but with the mirror, a small polished disk of bronze that caught the morning sun and revealed the self as both mortal and divine. To the Egyptians, the reflection was not a simple likeness but a living presence, a momentary glimpse into the harmony of Mot that structured the cosmos. The mirror showed not merely the face, but the balance within it, the smoothness of skin, the cleanliness of form, the careful order of hair. For in their philosophy, beauty was never vanity, it was righteousness. A disordered body was a sign of spiritual imbalance, a threat to the eternal symmetry upon which the universe rested. Thus, the laws of appearance were laws of survival, and among these, the governance of hair was the most meticulous of all. Every rank, every profession, every season of life had its own commandments. The head was sacred territory, the seat of the ka, and its adornment or absence of adornment was a statement not of fashion but of cosmic obedience. In the temple schools of Heliopolis, where priests were trained to read the stars and interpret the will of Ra, initiates learned that to maintain purity of hair was to maintain purity of thought. Before they could touch a sacred object or recite a single hymn, they were required to shave their heads and bodies, to remove every vestige of the natural in favor of the perfected. The act was both physical and spiritual, a symbolic death of the ungoverned self, the wild creature that must be subdued before one could stand before the gods. Their razors were polished to a near mirror finish, reflecting the light of the sacred flame. Each stroke of the blade was accompanied by a quiet recitation, a reminder that the body was not their own but borrowed from the divine. To allow hair to grow unbidden was to invite impurity, to neglect the razor was to neglect the balance that held the world in place. In this, the Egyptians saw no cruelty, no repression, only harmony, the discipline of being in tune with cosmic order. But beyond the temples, in the dusty courtyards and narrow streets of Memphis and Thebes, the laws of hair extended even to the common people. Each class had its pattern, its acceptable form. A laborer might wear his hair short or even shaven, both for cleanliness and practicality, while a merchant or scribe would cultivate a modest style, carefully oiled, neatly braided, perhaps tied at the back with a strip of linen. For women, the rules were even more intricate. A married woman's hair was to be concealed beneath a wig or kerchief in public, a gesture of modesty and respect. Only in the privacy of the home, or in ritual lamentation at funerals, could she let it loose. A noblewoman's hair was her social mirror, its luster and scent spoke of her household's wealth, her devotion to purity, her alignment with Mot. The oils used to anoint it were measured with precision, castor, almond, and lotus, mixed according to recipes recorded on fragments of papyrus, each ingredient chosen for its symbolic as well as practical virtue. To neglect one's hair, or to appear unkempt, was to risk accusation of spiritual decay, for in Egyptian thought, external disorder was an outward symptom of inward chaos. Even the pharaoh, divine as he was, obeyed these laws. In the reliefs of the New Kingdom, we see him both shaven and wigged, two faces of authority that mirror the dual nature of kingship itself. The shaven head represented purity, readiness for ritual, the direct channel between man and God. The wig, elaborate and symmetrical, represented divine order manifest upon the earth, the outer sign of the ruler's role as the living image of the gods. His was not a crown of vanity but of power sustained by control. Before each ceremony, royal barbers, themselves trained under priestly supervision, would shave the pharaoh's scalp with razors of copper and gold, anointing it with sacred oils afterward. The cuttings were collected and burned, lest they fall into the hands of those who might use them for spells. For hair, as every Egyptian knew, could bind the spirit. It could be used to heal or to harm, to summon love or to curse enemies. Thus, even the hair of kings was guarded as carefully as their treasure. To modern eyes, these rules might seem obsessive, even oppressive, but to those who lived under the blazing sun of the two lands, they were acts of devotion. In every gesture of grooming there was prayer, in every braid, an echo of creation. The goddess Hathor, patron of beauty and music, was said to have combed the hair of Ra himself with a golden comb each morning, untangling the light of dawn. To comb one's hair was, therefore, to imitate the divine act, to restore order to the world after the night's chaos. Women invoked Hathor as they anointed their hair, believing that her presence would make them radiant and protected. Men invoked Osiris, whose rebirth each year was symbolized by the green growth of plants. Even the renewal of hair mirrored his eternal cycle. In every strand lay a metaphor for life, death, and regeneration. The Egyptians even assigned hair colors symbolic meaning. Black was fertility, vitality, the richness of the soil. Reddish tones, rare but revered, were associated with the desert and the power of Set, dangerous but potent. Wigs were often dyed with henna or indigo to achieve a desired hue, and those shades themselves could carry ritual weight. A black wig could signify mourning, while a blue-black sheen might be worn in festival to mimic the divine hair of the gods, who were said to shimmer like lapis lazuli. To wear such a color was not mere ornamentation but invocation, a subtle calling of the divine into the self. The maintenance of hair thus became an act of continual alignment, a daily negotiation between the mortal and the eternal. In household shrines, small offerings of hair were sometimes found among the votive gifts, curls tied with linen, sealed in clay jars, and placed before the household gods. These were tokens of devotion, gestures of humility, reminders that even the humblest part of the body could serve the divine if consecrated properly. The idea that hair could contain the soul's essence led to customs surrounding death as well. When a loved one died, mourners might cut a lock of their own hair as an offering, binding it to the body of the deceased or burying it with amulets. The gesture expressed grief, but also faith, the belief that through the mingling of hair, life could continue in the realm beyond. To lose a strand was not to lose a piece of oneself but to send it forth as a messenger, a thread bridging worlds. Among the scribes, the keepers of knowledge, there were even texts detailing the regulations of hair for various ranks. Fragments from the Instruction of the House of Purity describe how novices in temple service were to shave every third day, while higher priests were to maintain total smoothness, using a mixture of natron and pumice between shavings to preserve the sheen of the scalp. The same text warns against vanity, reminding that, to love the hair too much is to invite pride, to neglect it is to invite decay. Balance was all. A priest who spent too much time adorning himself was thought to be swayed by isfet, the force of disorder, even if his hair appeared perfect. Thus, the discipline of hair was not merely cleanliness, but moral moderation embodied. In the workshops of wigmakers, this balance took physical form. Skilled artisans, often women trained within temple guilds, wove wigs strand by strand upon linen caps or nets of human hair. Their tools were simple: bone needles, beeswax, thin cords. Yet their artistry was profound. Some wigs were designed to fall in heavy geometric braids, others to frame the face with tight curls or layered waves. Each pattern corresponded to rank and occasion. A Nubian wig, short and tightly curled, might be worn by officials or soldiers. A goddess wig, long and flowing, was reserved for noblewomen during ceremonies of fertility or feasting. The wigs were perfumed and sometimes adorned with gold beads or faience. In them, identity could be renewed. To don a wig was to put on the world's order, to cloak oneself in the perfection denied to the flesh. The very making of these wigs was seen as a sacred process. Before beginning work, the wigmaker would wash, shave, and purify herself, offering incense to Hathor and Bes, the household god of beauty and protection. She might whisper a blessing over the hair she wove, ensuring it brought no misfortune. The strands she used were not chosen at random. Some were donations, others traded, others collected from the deceased, all purified through smoke before use. This blending of sources gave the wig a strange dual nature. It was both many and one, alive and lifeless, earthly and divine. To wear it was to participate in a kind of resurrection, a daily reminder that the self could be remade, that perfection could be achieved through ritual. And so, every morning, as the city stirred under the sun, the people of Egypt engaged in their quiet rites of order. Barbers opened their stalls, oils were warmed over coals, and the air filled with the faint hum of commerce and devotion. Children had their heads shaved save for the side lock of youth, symbol of Horus's protection. Mothers braided the hair of daughters in patterns meant to ward off evil. Priests polished their razors and prepared for purification. The Nile flowed on, eternal, reflecting the same rituals generation after generation. The sound of comb-through hair, the glint of oiled strands, the scent of cedar and lotus, these were the music of civilization. For in Egypt, to be clean was to be holy, and to be holy was to be in harmony with the breath of the gods. And yet, beneath this harmony, the faint shadow of fear persisted. For what was order, if not the endless struggle against the chaos that waited to reclaim the world? Every strand that grew was a reminder that the wild was always returning, creeping in from the edges of the desert, whispering that perfection could never be permanent. The Egyptians knew this, though they seldom spoke it aloud. Their laws of hair were not merely rules of appearance but defenses against entropy itself, the constant assertion that Mot still reigned. In their devotion, there was both beauty and unease, both peace and vigilance. The razor must always be ready, the wig must always gleam. To neglect either was to open the door to the darkness beyond the veil, where even the gods must comb the tangles of the night. The deeper one ventures into the fabric of Egyptian law, the more one begins to see how inseparable it was from ritual, how what appeared to be simple hygiene or beauty was in fact a slow, rhythmic devotion to the laws that governed existence itself. Every aspect of grooming had its prescribed time, its accompanying chant, its shadowed meaning. The regulations around hair were not just social conventions but echoes of the first acts of creation, when the universe itself was combed from chaos. The priests taught that in the beginning, before the first sunrise, the world was tangled, a swirling darkness from which order had to be drawn strand by strand. Ra, the great god, emerged and illuminated the void, his rays spreading like golden hair across the blackness of the primordial waters. Each ray was a filament of harmony, each light a thread in the weaving of reality. To the Egyptians, this myth was not metaphor but memory, and so each act of grooming was a reenactment of that divine disentanglement, a small victory of order over disorder, of Mot over Isfet. To let one's hair fall into neglect was to risk returning to that primordial chaos, and so the daily combing, shaving, and oiling became acts of cosmic maintenance, gestures that sustained the universe as surely as the rituals in the temples. The barbers who moved through the cities were thus not mere tradesmen but participants in this sacred continuity. Their profession was ancient, honored yet humble, bound by codes that blurred the line between practical and sacred service. They carried razors and combs in small leather pouches, tools that gleamed in the sunlight as they worked in courtyards or beneath palm awnings. Their hands were steady, their manner subdued, for to cut hair was to touch the boundary between purity and defilement. Many barbers recited short prayers before each client, and when they finished, they collected the cuttings carefully, depositing them in clay jars that were later sealed or burned in small ceremonies. Some temples even maintained their own barbers, whose sole duty was to attend to priests before dawn ceremonies. These men were considered cleaners of the divine path, and though they were of lower rank, their touch was considered dangerous in its intimacy, a service that cleansed others but could defile the self if not performed with caution. A careless slip of the razor, an unspoken impurity in the heart, and one might find oneself excluded from temple precincts, spiritually unbalanced, unfit for worship. To handle the hair of the holy was to handle the essence of order, and the risk of imbalance was constant. Within the palace walls, barbers served a still higher calling. The pharaoh's personal attendants were trained not only in the art of cutting but in the philosophy of purity. Each morning, before they approached the ruler, they purified their hands in natron water, burned myrrh to steady their thoughts, and recited oaths of service. The ritual of shaving the royal head was a moment of silence, no idle talk, no laughter, only the quiet rasp of the blade and the breath of incense. The pharaoh's scalp, after each shave, was anointed with oil mixed from sacred ingredients, lotus for rebirth, frankincense for divinity, cedar for endurance. The hair that fell from his head was collected and sealed in alabaster jars, stored in secret chambers beneath the palace. Some scholars believe these remnants were later used in ritual offerings to ensure the continued vitality of the king's ka, a preservation of essence through that which had been severed. To destroy hair was to destroy a link to the self. To preserve it was to guard the spark of divinity. But not all Egyptians had the privilege of purification through service. Among the poor, hair was both burden and identity, a mark of survival in the relentless sun. They lacked the oils and razors of the elite, yet even they maintained the rhythm of cleansing. Some used river water mixed with natron, others smeared their hair with clay to protect it from heat and insects. These acts, though humble, were still echoes of Mot, still gestures of resistance against decay. In the evenings, families would sit together under flickering lamplight, mothers picking lice from children's hair, men trimming one another's locks with bronze knives, small, domestic rituals of order in a world ruled by sand and wind. The smell of smoke and oil, the rhythmic movements of comb and hand, were as sacred in their way as the chants of the priests. To keep one's hair clean, even in poverty, was to honor the gods who governed all things, for cleanliness was holiness, and holiness did not belong only to the rich. It was in funerary rites, however, that the laws of hair took on their most mysterious form. The preparation of the dead demanded a mastery of purification, for the body was to be made perfect before entering eternity. Embalmers, men who lived in the outer shadows of society, were both feared and revered, for they handled what others would not dare to touch. When they came to the head, their work became almost priestly. The scalp was washed with palm wine and water of natron, and if hair remained, it was oiled, braided, or sometimes entirely removed according to the rank and custom of the deceased. In some cases, especially for women of nobility, wigs were placed upon the head before burial, not merely as adornment but as symbols of resurrection. For to enter the afterlife with disordered hair would be to enter it unprepared, vulnerable to decay and confusion. The wig restored balance, provided a perfected image of the self for eternity. Some tombs even contain spare wigs, sealed in boxes alongside perfumes and combs, as if the dead might wish to change their appearance in the afterworld. It was believed that in the field of reeds, where the blessed souls lived on, the gods themselves would recognize a person by the harmony of their form, and to appear before them disheveled was to risk being forgotten. Even mourning had its prescribed disorder. At funerals, women would unbind their hair and scatter ashes upon it, wailing and striking their breasts. This was the one sanctioned moment when chaos could be shown, when the symmetry of life could be broken without offense. Their disheveled hair symbolized grief's descent into disorder, and through that display, the community acknowledged the rupture that death caused in the harmony of the world. Yet even here, rules held sway. The mourner's hair would later be washed and rebraided, their purity restored through ritual bathing. The temporary chaos was permitted only because it reaffirmed the necessity of order afterward. In every expression of emotion, there was a corresponding act of control, the endless rhythm of loosening and binding that mirrored the cycle of life and death itself. The sacred texts of the Book of the Body, a now lost manual said to have existed in temple archives, spoke of hair as the shadow of thought. The scalp was the field of consciousness, and hair was its harvest. To shave it was to reap, to cut away confusion and pride, to adorn it was to celebrate the flowering of creation. This language reveals a deeper philosophy beneath the visible customs. The Egyptians did not see the body as a mere vessel but as a microcosm of the universe, a landscape where moral and cosmic forces played out. Every strand of hair was a filament of energy linking the individual to the divine order. If neglected, it could entangle the soul; if properly maintained, it became a channel of light. Thus, the meticulous care given to hair was not vanity but metaphysics, the physical manifestation of a cosmic discipline. In the quieter corners of temples, archaeologists have found small combs made of ivory, often inscribed with hieroglyphs invoking protection or vitality. One such comb, found in the tomb of a noble woman, bore the inscription, "May your hair be like that of Hathor, ever fragrant, ever shining." Another, discovered near Abydos, carried an image of a lion's head, the emblem of Sekhmet, goddess of both destruction and healing, suggesting that even the act of combing carried dual significance, an invitation to both beauty and danger. The gods themselves, depicted in murals and statuary, or stylized hair or wigs that denoted their domains, Osiris with green-black strands symbolizing rebirth, Isis with a cascade of straight hair representing nurturing continuity, Anubis with the sleek wig of the embalmer, bridging life and death. Each curl, each lock, was theological. But what happens when law and devotion become indistinguishable, when the human body becomes a script upon which divine order is endlessly rewritten? For the Egyptians, this was not imprisonment but peace. To live under rule was to live within harmony. And yet, one cannot help but feel the faint tremor beneath the calm, the sense that such perfection required constant vigilance, that chaos was always waiting to return. Every dawn, as the priests took up their razors and the women donned their wigs, they were participating in an endless ritual of containment. The Nile rose and fell, bringing fertility and flood, hair grew and was cut, an eternal ebb and flow of creation and destruction. The people of the two lands lived within this rhythm, never questioning it, never daring to defy it. To do so would be to fall out of tune with the universe itself. In the late New Kingdom, as Egypt began to fade beneath the weight of foreign powers, even then the old laws of hair persisted. Persian governors and Greek envoys, bewildered by the intricacy of Egyptian customs, wrote of barbers who recited prayers, of women whose wigs were considered more sacred than their jewels. The old order held on through ritual, even as the temples crumbled. Hair became, in those final centuries, a relic of identity, the last thread connecting the people to their ancient gods. When the Romans came, they laughed at the Egyptian devotion to shaving, calling it excessive, effeminate, even superstitious. Yet to the Egyptians, it was neither superstition nor vanity but memory, the memory of creation, of divine order born from the void. To abandon that would have been to surrender to chaos, and so they continued, razors glinting under foreign suns, performing the old rites in silence. And now, as the centuries have drifted into dust, and the tombs have opened once more to the desert light, the hair of the ancients still lies waiting. In sealed coffins, beneath painted masks, strands of black remain, glistening faintly after 3,000 years, untouched, preserved, defying time itself. They lie coiled like forgotten thoughts, as if still breathing, still alive in their stillness. Perhaps they are. Perhaps in those delicate filaments, the law of Mot endures, whispering across the ages that order, once invoked, never wholly dies. The Egyptians knew this truth in their bones, in their rituals, in their razors and combs. The law of the body was the law of the universe, and the hair, that living, dying, growing symbol, was its most intimate expression. In each strand was the story of their world, the endless struggle between the wild and the divine, between the self and the sacred order that shaped it. And so, even now, in the still air of the tombs, one might imagine the faintest echo, the sound of a comb passing gently through eternity, the law of the body whispered once more into the silence of time. There was, in ancient Egypt, a silence that followed the act of shaving, a silence not of emptiness, but of reverence, of transformation, of the shedding of one layer of existence and the quiet dawning of another. Beneath the eternal gaze of Ra and the watchful eyes of the gods, to shave one's head was never a mere act of cleanliness or vanity. It was an invocation, a ritual gesture that spoke of devotion, purity, and the endless renewal that governed both body and soul. The Egyptians, so deeply attuned to cycles of life and death, saw hair not only as an adornment but as a conduit for divine energy, a vessel that could harbor impurity if left untamed, or channel sacred essence if properly tended. The ritual of shaving thus stood at the threshold between the mundane and the sacred, between decay and renewal. Every stroke of the blade was a whisper to the cosmos, every fallen strand a token offered to the gods, relinquished so that the self might be remade. In the early light of the Nile's dawn, priests could be seen standing in the courtyards of temples, their bodies glistening with oil, their heads smooth and luminous, reflecting the sun as if in silent mimicry of the solar disk itself. The act of shaving was performed with blades of sharpened copper or bronze, honed to a sacred edge. To the uninitiated, it might have seemed a simple routine, a daily grooming task, practical in the desert heat, but to the priest, it was a ceremony that bound him to divine order. Before entering the temple precincts, his body had to be made immaculate. His hair was an earthly burden, capable of harboring dust, decay, and invisible forces that could defile the sanctity of the God's presence. Thus, every 3 days, and sometimes more often, the priest's entire body was shaved, head, face, arms, legs, even the faintest trace of hair upon the skin. This act was not born from disdain for the natural form, but from the recognition that the divine demanded a state beyond the natural, a state of cultivated perfection. The razor itself was a sacred object. It was not to be handled carelessly, nor to be used outside the ritual bounds. Some temples kept their razors within sealed caskets, guarded alongside the sacred oils and unguents. The metal gleamed faintly under lamplight as the priest took it up, murmuring invocations to the protective deities. The god Thoth, master of wisdom, was sometimes called upon to steady the hand and guide the blade, for to draw blood during shaving was seen as an ill omen, a sign that one's inner impurity had resisted cleansing. Yet when the ritual was performed flawlessly, it was said that the priest's skin would glow with a sheen of divine favor, his body reflecting purity itself. He would then anoint himself with perfumed oils, not merely to soften the skin but to complete the transformation, to seal the ritual of shaving with the essence of renewal. Women, too, participated in acts of sacred shaving, though theirs were subtler, more hidden, interwoven with domestic ritual and private devotion. Among noblewomen, the removal of hair was an art of both beauty and sanctity. They depilate their bodies with mixtures of honey, sugar, and natron, heated until golden and pliant, then smoothed upon the skin and swiftly removed. This was not vanity as the modern mind might imagine it, but a form of discipline, an echo of the same impulse that led priests to shave their heads. To be hairless was to be pure, to align oneself with the principle of cosmic order. Hair, left ungoverned, was the wilderness of the body, its removal, a cultivation of harmony. In households along the Nile, mothers shaved the heads of their children, leaving only a single lock, the side lock of youth, which hung by the ear, sometimes braided, sometimes left free to sway. This lock was the mark of childhood, a symbol that the child still belonged to the protective embrace of the goddess Isis, who shielded them from the chaos that lurked beyond the walls of order. When the child reached maturity, the lock would be cut in a solemn ceremony, its severing signifying the transition into the domain of adulthood and responsibility. This act, too, was a ritual of renewal, a miniature mirror of the cosmic cycles that governed all Egyptian life. The priests of the Temple of Karnak kept records of shaving as if they were astronomical events. The cycles of purification were aligned with the phases of the moon and the heliacal rising of Sirius. Each ritual was a reflection of the heavens, an earthly imitation of cosmic rebirth. The Egyptians saw no divide between the personal and the divine. The body was a microcosm of the universe, and to purify it through shaving was to participate in the eternal rhythm of creation. The hair that fell to the temple floor was sometimes gathered and buried, sometimes burned in incense fires, mingling with resins and oils until the air shimmered with fragrance. The smoke that rose from the brazier carried the essence of transformation skyward. Hair turned to vapor, the material rendered immaterial, a fitting metaphor for the Egyptian belief in the persistence of spirit beyond flesh. Even in death, the ritual of shaving endured. The embalmer, in preparing the body, would first shave away all hair, cleansing the corpse of earthly residue before anointing it with oils and resins. The dead were thus stripped of mortal impurity, readied for their journey through the duat, the shadowed realm of the afterlife. The wig that would later be placed upon the mummy was not a decoration, but a restoration of identity, a symbol that though the physical hair had been sacrificed to purity, the spiritual essence remained whole. In this duality, the removal and restoration of hair, lay one of the deepest mysteries of Egyptian belief, that destruction and creation were not opposites, but phases of the same eternal cycle. Among commoners, shaving was less ornate, but no less meaningful. In the heat of the delta and the arid plains, men would shave their heads not only to remain cool but to free themselves from lice, pests, and the discomforts of the physical world. Yet even this mundane act took on a certain sacredness in Egyptian culture, for cleanliness was next to godliness, and personal hygiene itself was a reflection of spiritual order. Barbers, therefore, held a curious status in society. They were not mere tradesmen, but intermediaries, individuals who enacted, with each shave, a quiet version of the temple ritual. To be shaved by another was to entrust one's body to ritual care, to allow another to reshape the boundary between impurity and sanctity. Many barbers were itinerant, moving from home to home, carrying their copper razors wrapped in linen and their oils sealed in small alabaster jars. They were, in their way, priests of the everyday. The act of shaving before festivals or sacred ceremonies was obligatory. Before entering the temple during the festival of Opet or the Feast of the Valley, both men and women underwent cleansing rituals that included the shaving of body hair. To present oneself to the gods in any state of physical disorder was a kind of sacrilege, an affront to the cosmic harmony the deities upheld. The Nile itself, the lifeblood of Egypt, was the instrument of cleansing. Those who bathed in its waters before shaving were believed to be doubly purified, for they were washed by the river that was said to flow from the realm of the gods. At dawn, when the world was still half dreaming, one could imagine the soft whisper of razors in the distance, faint, rhythmic, like the murmur of prayers carried on the desert wind. The scent of myrrh and palm oil lingered in the air. The priests, newly shaven, stepped into the inner sanctum, their smooth scalps gleaming like orbs of light beneath flickering lamps. Their bodies, anointed and purified, became living vessels of divine presence. The god's image, whether Ammonius, Ra, or Osiris, received them with silence, the silence of eternity. And in that moment, as they stood between the mortal and the divine, they embodied the cycle of shaving and renewal, the perpetual shedding of imperfection in the pursuit of sacred equilibrium. The Egyptian understood something modern eyes often overlook, that in the smallest acts of the body lay the reflection of the cosmos. The cut of a razor, the smoothness of a scalp, the gleam of oil beneath sunlight, all these were forms of prayer, movements in a choreography that echoed through temples and tombs alike. To shave was not merely to remove hair, it was to erase the trace of chaos, to return the self to a primordial state of order. Each hair removed was a strand of disorder undone. Each morning, the priest, the noble, the peasant, all took part in this silent ritual of renewal, aligning their lives, however briefly, with the divine rhythm of creation itself. To understand the full gravity of the Egyptian ritual of shaving, one must first unlearn the modern sense of grooming as a purely aesthetic or hygienic practice. For in the quiet rhythm of the razor against the skin lay a theology older than the written word, a language of purity inscribed not on papyrus but upon flesh itself. In ancient Egypt, to shave was to make a statement before the cosmos, to proclaim oneself willing to cast off the mortal husk, the encumbrance of the earthly body, and to stand in symbolic nakedness before the gods. The act was not simply removal, it was renewal. Each pass of the blade across the scalp echoed the sun's journey across the sky, cutting away the darkness of the night, restoring the smooth brilliance of morning. Thus, shaving was both an imitation and an offering, the mortal's answer to the endless cycles of destruction and rebirth that animated the divine order. In the temples, this belief took on a rhythm so exacting it bordered on sacred obsession. Priests were required to shave not only their heads but their entire bodies every other day, sometimes twice daily during festivals. No hair, not even the faintest shadow, was permitted to exist upon their skin. In this, they became living embodiments of the god Ra, who renewed himself each dawn in radiant perfection. The discipline of this ritual was immense, it required precision, patience, and devotion. In the cool light of dawn, a priest might kneel before a copper basin filled with Nile water, its surface quivering with reflected flame. He would take up a bronze razor, murmur the words of purification, and draw it slowly along the curve of his skull. The faint rasping sound, hair yielding to metal, became a sacred refrain, a hymn of silence and surrender. It was said that in these moments, when the flesh was bared and the scent of oil filled the air, the boundary between man and God grew thin, almost transparent. The hair, once removed, was never discarded carelessly. In the early dynasties, the shavings were gathered and burned, a symbolic offering to the gods. The smoke that rose from this act was thought to carry away not only the physical remnants of impurity but also the invisible residue of moral and spiritual imperfection. Each curl of smoke was a prayer, a fragment of the self released into the heavens. Later, during the New Kingdom, the hair of high priests and temple attendants was sometimes buried in small jars, sealed and inscribed with protective hieroglyphs. These jars were placed within the temple grounds, as though the purged fragments of humanity were being returned to the earth, to be cleansed and renewed by the same cycle that nourished the Nile. The symbolism of shaving extended into the mysteries of kingship. When a pharaoh ascended the throne, his body underwent an elaborate series of purifications that mirrored those of the priests but on a grander, almost cosmic scale. The royal barbers, chosen for their skill and steadiness, performed the ritual in silence, for speech during the act could invite misfortune. The razor that touched the king's flesh was consecrated in advance, its blade bathed in sacred oils and kissed by the breath of the temple incense. As each strand fell, so too did the remnants of the old life, the man who had once been mortal, and what emerged was the living Horus, the divine ruler reborn. Even the faint stubble that might dare to return in the days following was removed again and again, as if to deny the body any claim to mortality. The king's shaven scalp gleamed beneath the crown, a visible symbol of his transcendence over ordinary flesh. It is easy, perhaps, to see this through modern eyes as mere ceremony, but in the Egyptian mind it was no different than the rising of the sun, no less vital than the flooding of the Nile. It was order made visible. The same forces that governed the movement of the stars also governed the growth of hair, and to shave was to assert human will over that slow, silent growth, to discipline nature into the divine harmony. In neglecting one's hair, a person signaled chaos, the creeping disorder of Isfet. To allow the beard or scalp to grow wild was to flirt with the very principle of decay. The priests of Osiris warned that a man who neglected his grooming invited spiritual contamination, that his soul would smell of neglect when he entered the hall of judgment. The smooth scalp, the polished skin, these were the markers of the soul's readiness to face eternity. Yet there were moments, quiet and fleeting, when the ritual of shaving revealed its more human dimensions. In tomb paintings and fragments of papyrus, one finds scenes of barbers crouched beside their clients, the two men sharing a still intimacy, a trust that transcended class and rank. The barber's hands were steady, his eyes calm, his gestures deliberate. He was part craftsman, part confidant, part silent priest. The Egyptians believed that to touch another's head was to touch their essence, their ka, and so the barber's work required both physical skill and spiritual sensitivity. Many barbers belonged to hereditary guilds, their tools passed down through generations, the same razors cutting across centuries of skin. The sound of the blade became, for many, the music of life continuing, the reminder that purification was a cycle without end. In the homes of the wealthy, slaves and attendants performed similar rituals of care. A nobleman reclining on a low couch might have his scalp shaved and oiled while music played softly in the background, flutes, lyres, and the rhythmic clapping of hands. The act of grooming was itself a ritual of relaxation and reflection. Some accounts speak of men who collected their shorn hair in linen bundles, placing them among personal items in their tombs, as if acknowledging that even what was discarded in life might have significance in death. Hair was, after all, an extension of the body, and the Egyptians were meticulous about wholeness in burial. Nothing of the self was meaningless. Everything, even what had been shaved away, could carry symbolic weight. Among women, the shaving ritual held different but equally profound meanings. For many, it marked the transition from maidenhood to marriage, from fertility to motherhood, from the temporal to the eternal. A bride might shave her head before donning a ceremonial wig, her bare scalp anointed with lotus oil and scented resins. This was not humiliation but transformation, a shedding of the old identity in preparation for the new. The act echoed the myth of Isis, who, in her mourning for Osiris, shaved her head in sorrow and renewal, symbolizing both loss and the eternal return of life. The goddess's grief became the human model for renewal through purification. One must first be stripped bare before one can be restored. Thus, in every household, small acts of shaving and cleansing became reflections of cosmic truths. Even the soldier, standing before battle, might shave his head before donning his helmet. This was not only practical, to prevent lice in the hot sun, but spiritual. To go into battle with a clean-shaven head was to go forth purified, one's body made ready for either survival or death. A soldier who fell in battle would meet the gods in a state of ritual purity, free of earthly taint. In this way, the razor was both a weapon and a blessing, its edge dividing the mortal from the divine. There are hints, too, that shaving carried echoes of magic, of hidden rites whispered only among the initiated. Some texts describe priests shaving their heads and bodies before performing spells of renewal or resurrection, as if the physical act were a key that unlocked metaphysical gates. The magician, bare of hair and clothed in linen, would recite the words of power, his voice low and steady, his body luminous with oil. The absence of hair was thought to make him impervious to evil spirits, who clung to impurities and hid in the tangled recesses of the body. To be shaven was to be invisible to them, untouched by corruption. Thus, in the dimly lit chambers of ritual, the gleaming scalp was more than flesh, it was an amulet of light. The Egyptian day was shaped by such rituals, each echoing the cosmic pattern. Shaving in the morning was the echo of creation, bathing at noon was the renewal of life, anointing at dusk was the preparation for death. And within that cycle, hair, its growth, removal, and restoration, was a quiet language of continuity. The priests taught that every strand of hair removed from the body symbolized one of the serpent heads of Apophis, the enemy of Ra, cut away and cast down. In keeping oneself shaven, one participated in the daily victory of order over chaos, of light over shadow. And yet, there was something haunting in this discipline, something that lingered at the edge of perfection. For hair, like memory, always returned. The priest could shave and shave again, but the shadow of growth would reappear, a reminder that chaos, too, was eternal, that order existed only through constant renewal. Each day the ritual must begin again, each dawn the razor must touch the skin once more. The smooth scalp glistened for a moment, then time itself began its slow rebellion. In this endless repetition lay the true essence of Egyptian spirituality, the acknowledgement that nothing is ever complete, that the work of purification is infinite. And so, as the centuries drifted over the sands and temples crumbled into dust, the ritual endured in memory. The razors dulled and corroded, the oils dried up, but the idea, that purity must be earned again and again, that renewal is born from surrender, remained. The Egyptian, standing before his reflection in a bowl of water, understood something timeless, that in the act of shaving, he was both erasing and remembering himself. The water rippled, the image dissolved, and in that brief shimmer between smoothness and reflection, between self and no self, the eternal was glimpsed, quiet, unblinking, waiting beneath the skin. To the ancient Egyptian, a wig was not a disguise, nor a luxury of vanity, but a crown of identity, a boundary drawn between flesh and divinity, between life and death, between the visible and the concealed. The wig was both mask and revelation, a sacred covering that redefined the person who wore it. Beneath its carefully woven strands lay a secret understanding that hair, once removed, must somehow return, not as it once was, but as something consecrated. In this way, the Egyptian wig was more than an adornment of fashion, it was an artifact of resurrection. Every lock, every curl, every bead threaded into the hair spoke of rebirth and renewal. It was, in truth, a crown for the living, and for the dead. The earliest wigs were simple, braids of human hair bound with linen, shaped to rest neatly upon the shaven scalp. They were meant to mimic natural hair, yet their smooth perfection betrayed something otherworldly. Over the centuries, they grew elaborate, layered, perfumed, and coiled in intricate patterns that defied the passage of time. In the tomb paintings of Thebes and Saqqara, men and women alike are shown wearing thick, lustrous wigs that cascade to the shoulders, sometimes arranged in tight curls, sometimes in geometric rows that gleam beneath painted gold. The styles varied by status and occasion, yet all carried a similar weight of meaning. The wig was not merely to conceal baldness or shield the head from the sun, it was to signify the triumph of order over disorder, the restoration of divine harmony through human hands. To understand this transformation, one must recall the Egyptian obsession with Ma'at, the balance, the cosmic rightness that held the universe together. Hair, left to grow uncontrolled, was nature unbounded, it belonged to the realm of wilderness and decay. But the wig, fashioned through skill and symmetry, brought that wilderness into submission. It represented civilization itself, the shaping of chaos into form. To place a wig upon the head was to clothe oneself in order, to wear the emblem of humanity's defiance against the forces of dissolution. The Egyptians did not merely wear wigs, they believed themselves transformed by them. A shaven head was the mark of purity, but a wig was the mark of identity, the restoration of form once chaos had been cleansed away. There was ritual in the very making of the wig. Women of the household, or professional artisans known as hemtu, would sit before low tables of polished wood, weaving strands of hair, human, animal, or plant fiber, into intricate nets. Some wigs were created entirely of human hair, carefully sorted by color and texture. Others combined layers of human and palm fiber, the natural and the crafted woven together in delicate harmony. The artisans worked in silence, their fingers moving with a patient rhythm that echoed the weaving of linen for mummification. Each motion was part of a ceremony of transformation, for what they made was not merely an object, but a vessel of being. When completed, the wig was washed with scented water, anointed with oils, and stored in alabaster jars or wooden boxes wrapped in linen. It was not to be handled casually, it was a sacred extension of the body itself. In the palaces of Thebes, noblemen wore wigs as symbols of office. Their forms varied according to rank: short, rounded wigs for officials and scribes, cascading locks for courtiers and nobles. Each style communicated something of the wearer's role and virtue, as if the arrangement of curls were a language of social order. A poorly kept wig was a scandal; it suggested neglect not only of the body but of the soul. To appear before one's superiors without a properly prepared wig was to commit a silent blasphemy against Mot. Even Pharaoh himself, whose own head was shaved as a mark of divine purity, wore wigs of immense splendor when he appeared in public, thick with gold beads, lapis lazuli, and ribbons of blue enamel. Beneath that artificial hair, his shaven scalp gleamed unseen, a reminder that the true self lay always beneath the surface. Among women, the wig was an even deeper symbol, one tied to fertility, beauty, and resurrection. The goddess Hathor, patroness of love and music, was often depicted with flowing hair or elaborate wigs adorned with ribbons and lotus blossoms. Her image became the standard for earthly beauty, and women sought to emulate her form through the art of the wig. To wear a wig perfumed with lotus oil was to invite the goddess's favor, to embody her grace in both life and ritual. During festivals, women would don their finest wigs and adorn them with cones of scented wax that slowly melted in the heat, releasing fragrance that clung to the hair like a prayer. In that mingling of scent and movement, of ritual and sensuality, the Egyptians found a bridge between pleasure and holiness. But the wig's most profound role was found not among the living, but among the dead. In the tombs, the wig was as essential as the linen wrappings or the amulets. The deceased, shaven and purified by the embalmers, was given a wig to wear in death, a sign that the physical body, though stripped of its corruption, retained its divine identity. The wig restored what had been taken, symbolizing wholeness in the afterlife. Without it, the spirit risked wandering in incompleteness, its ka unanchored, its ba unrecognizable to the gods. Some wigs were made solely for burial, crafted from fine linen threads dyed black and woven into imitation braids. Others, belonging to nobles or royalty, were the very same wigs they had worn in life, preserved with care and buried alongside their jewelry, their mirrors, and their combs. The embalming process itself mirrored the same principle. The removal of hair during mummification was an act of purification, a severing of the mortal coil, but the replacement of a wig upon the corpse was an act of resurrection. In that gesture lay the entire Egyptian theology of renewal. What is taken away must be restored, what is destroyed must be remade, what is cut must grow again in another form. The dead were reborn not as bald remnants of flesh, but as perfected beings, crowned in eternal order. When the priests laid the wig upon the mummy's head, they did so with murmured invocations, their voices low and steady as the shadows of dusk. "May your hair live again," they whispered. "May your beauty return as the gods intended. May your form endure as the sun endures." In that moment, the dead became whole, their shaved heads concealed beneath the crown of immortality. The Egyptians held that hair contained spiritual vitality, a remnant of one's life force. To remove it was to cleanse, but to destroy it entirely would be to risk the loss of essence. Thus the wig served as the reconciliation of opposites, a symbol that purity need not mean emptiness, that order could coexist with beauty. The wig was artificial, yet it was also the vessel of the true self. Its perfection reflected a higher reality, the divine order where no strand was out of place, no curl left untamed. The priests and philosophers of Memphis spoke of it in mystical terms. They said the wig was the head's ka, the visible soul of the crown. Without it, the body was incomplete. With it, the mortal mirrored the gods. In the carvings upon tomb walls, one sees the continuity of this belief, the unbroken flow of ritual that binds shaving to renewal, and renewal to adornment. The shaven head is not the end but the beginning, the empty vessel that awaits the divine covering. Each step in the ritual sequence, the shaving, the anointing, the donning of the wig, represents the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. The razor cuts, the oil restores, the wig completes. It is the same cycle enacted in the cosmos, the night that falls, the dawn that returns, the sun that dies and rises again from its own ashes. In the quiet chambers of ancient tombs, amid the fragrance of incense and the flickering of oil lamps, this belief found its most haunting expression. The mummy, shaven and wrapped, lay in silence. The priests gathered around, their own heads gleaming in the lamplight, their wigs resting upon stone shelves nearby. One priest lifted the funerary wig, its braids glistening with resin, and placed it gently upon the dead. The air trembled with the scent of myrrh. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the silence between heartbeat and eternity, and then the priests withdrew, their torches receding into shadow. The wig, now resting upon the embalmed head, was more than ornament. It was a promise. A promise that what had been lost would be found again, that death was only a pause between gestures, a moment between shaving and renewal. Outside, beyond the tomb, the desert stretched into infinity. The wind moved softly over the sand, carrying with it the faint scent of oils and the whisper of ancient voices. Somewhere, beneath that vast sky, a woman adjusted her wig in the dim light of her mirror, her reflection shimmering in the polished bronze. Her fingers traced the edge of the curls, the fine craftsmanship of each strand. In that gesture, small, private, eternal, she mirrored the rituals of kings and gods alike. The cycle continued. Purity, adornment, renewal. The living and the dead alike wore their crowns, and in that wearing, affirmed their place in the cosmic order. In the vast echo of the desert, where the hot wind drifts like a whisper across eternity, Chapter 3 continues, an unbroken meditation on the threads of hair and belief, on the way identity clung to the scalp like shadow to skin. To the ancient Egyptians, hair was not simply adornment but a medium of truth, a line between chaos and order, between the frail and the divine. And so, when the priests of Heliopolis rose in the hour before dawn, they did not merely wash and shave, they enacted creation itself. The razor, honed to a quiet gleam, was a blade of renewal, its edge tracing the thin margin between yesterday's self and today's rebirth. To shave was to die a little, to shed the husk of imperfection. The hairs that fell were not waste but relics, symbolic fragments of disorder being subdued. The ritual was meticulous, tender, and exacting. No stray hair was tolerated in the house of life, no accidental curl left behind. For within those stray filaments, the priests believed, disorder could breed, and with it, the ancient serpent of chaos might stir. Each temple carried its own subtle rhythm of purification, but all adhered to the same sacred logic. The body must be made smooth as the gods intended it, pure and free of the animal's reminders. Even the lowliest scribe who entered the temple precinct knew the weight of this ideal. Hair carried the scent of the mortal world, the dust of streets, the sweat of labor, the whisper of decay. It was the priest's burden to rise above such things, to make his skin a vessel for Ma'at, the principle of truth and order. When he shaved, the water he used was not common water but drawn from sacred basins, blessed under hymns that called upon the waters of Nun, the primeval sea of creation. Thus, each stroke of the razor was an echo of the God separating light from darkness, self from corruption. And yet, for all its sanctity, this practice bore a quiet sorrow, for in stripping himself of hair, the priest also stripped away the symbols of individuality. He became, for a moment, a mirror of the divine, anonymous and eternal, his smoothness the mark of transcendence. But not all Egyptians followed the razor's path. In the towns and fields, among artisans and farmers, hair lived differently, woven into plaits that told of lineage, of village, of heart. These were people for whom hair was both shield and signature, an intimate biography braided in sunlight. A man's braid might bear amulets against the evil eye, a child's lock might be left uncut until the gods had granted protection, a woman's wig might conceal her true hair, lest others cast envy upon it. And though the priesthood sought purity through the blade, common folk found their own sanctity in adornment. The wig, in this paradoxical land, was both mask and revelation. Crafted from human hair or the softened fibers of palm, it rested upon shaved heads like an offering. To wear one was to step momentarily into another form, to assume grace beyond one's nature. Women would perfume their wigs with oils of lotus and myrrh, the scent rising like prayer in the heat. By night, the wigs were laid to rest upon carved stands, their curls gleaming in the dim oil light, their shadows merging with the household gods who guarded the threshold. And when the first light came, they would be brushed anew, every strand disciplined into harmony. This care was not vanity, it was faith. The smooth perfection of the wig mirrored the smooth perfection of the afterlife. The living rehearsed eternity in their grooming. In that stillness between brushstrokes, one might almost hear the faint susurration of the beyond, the gods murmuring approval through the silence of the comb's teeth. Yet within this symmetry, there lingered a fear: what if the hair rebelled? What if one's locks, neglected or disordered, became a home for spirits? The Egyptians believed that demons could cling to hair, not themselves within it, whispering sickness or madness into the soul. Hence, mothers sang while plaiting their children's hair, weaving not just beauty but protection. Each twist and tie was a spell against chaos. A child's hair was sacred, for it was new to the world, unburdened by deceit. In the temples, such beliefs merged with ritual precision. Even the pharaoh, embodiment of the divine, submitted to the barbers of the royal household. His hair was measured and maintained according to astrological alignments, its length and texture aligned with the stars. To trim it improperly was to disrupt the order of the heavens. This delicate balance between faith and form made the Egyptian relationship with hair one of perpetual tension, between concealment and revelation, humanity and divinity. The great queens understood this best. Hatshepsut, whose reign blurred the lines of gender and eternity, wore the ceremonial false beard of kingship. It was not hair, but it was its echo, a sculpted promise of power. In it lived the illusion of permanence. Beneath that artifice, her true hair was bound and hidden, her real self encased in symbols. The beard, the wig, the headdress, all these layers created a divine geometry of identity, each concealing what it claimed to reveal. To the ancient eye, truth was not nakedness but arrangement, the careful composition of illusion. And so, as centuries passed, the art of wig-making deepened into near sacrament. Craftsmen in Thebes and Memphis became alchemists of appearance. They sorted, cleansed, and wove strands into patterns that mimicked divine precision. Some wigs shimmered black as the Nile under moonlight, others glowed honey brown like dawn over limestone. Each was shaped to suit not only the face but the spirit. The most elaborate were reserved for the afterlife. In tombs, the dead were given wigs that would never tangle, oils that would never dry, combs that would never dull. The inscriptions beside them spoke softly of resurrection. May your hair be renewed like that of Ra at sunrise. For hair, unlike flesh, symbolized continuity. It grew even after death, it returned, it endured. In that endurance lay the whisper of immortality. The priests of Anubis, guardians of the embalming houses, understood this mystery. As they anointed the mummified heads, they murmured invocations not only to preserve the face but to preserve the semblance of vitality, the sheen of hair, the curve of brow, the eternal dignity of the visage. To lose one's hair was to lose one's name in the afterlife. Thus, false wigs were fitted upon the deceased with as much care as upon the living. Even the poor, who could not afford real hair, fashioned imitations from linen fiber, dyed and shaped with resin. No soul was meant to enter eternity bareheaded. To do so would be to wander without form. Through these gestures, hair became more than ornament, it was memory itself. Each strand bore the imprint of sun and time, of labor and longing. To shave it, to adorn it, to anoint it, these acts marked one's place in the great continuum between life and the afterlife. And beneath that order lingered the old fear that once chaos touched the hair, it might spread inward, unraveling the harmony of the self. Perhaps this is why even in tomb art, the most peaceful scenes, a woman's hand combing her hair, a servant oiling her mistress's scalp, carry a still unease. There is something in the act itself that binds fragility to ritual, that speaks of a struggle not yet won. In the quiet of such moments, when combs pass through strands that shimmer like river light, the boundary between the living and the dead seems to waver. Perhaps the priests felt it too, in their morning purifications, the faint recognition that to shave was not merely to cleanse but to erase. And yet, erasure was the path to eternity. Smooth skin, unblemished by the world's dust, mirrored the perfection of the gods. The razor's song was the hymn of transcendence. And in that music of removal, there was both loss and becoming, the eternal pulse of Egyptian faith, beating still beneath the sand, whispering through the strands that time could never fully cut away. The hush before dawn, when the first thread of sunlight brushed across the temples of Karnak and Thebes, illuminating the endless corridors where silence itself seemed to breathe. In those golden halls, among the incense smoke that curled like ghostly hair toward the sky, the Egyptians perfected the art of sanctifying the human image, a ritual both delicate and profound. Hair, in this late flowering of their civilization, had come to mean more than beauty, more than purity. It was the mirror of cosmic order. Each lock carried a portion of divine rhythm, each curl a geometry of creation. To touch the hair of another was to touch their essence, and so barbers became priests in miniature, their tools echoes of the sacred blades used by the temple attendants. They spoke softly as they worked, not out of courtesy but reverence. The sound of scissors was like prayer, a rhythmic invocation of precision and calm, each snip releasing what no longer belonged to the living form. In the tombs, this reverence was eternalized in paint and stone. One can still see, upon the walls of the noble dead, the images of women sitting serenely before mirrors of polished copper, their wigs cascading like dark waterfalls as attendants combed and perfumed them. These scenes were not mere vanity, they were symbols of order restored. The act of grooming, of setting the hair in perfect alignment, mirrored the act of the gods maintaining balance in the cosmos. The Egyptians believed that the universe itself could tangle, that chaos, like a knot, could grow unnoticed unless tended to. The comb, then, was not just an implement but an emblem of vigilance. To keep one's hair smooth was to participate in divine labor, to keep the world itself from fraying. And so the rituals of care deepened into something nearly sacred. Perfumed oils were poured into small alabaster jars, their surfaces cool and soft as moonlight. Women would dip their fingers and massage the scalp with circular grace, invoking Hathor, the goddess of beauty and music, who was said to carry in her tresses the scent of heaven. Hathor's temples often kept shrines where locks of devotees' hair were offered, wrapped in linen and tied with prayers. The hair was believed to hold fragments of the soul's resonance, and so to offer it was to surrender a part of the self to the divine harmony. Even men, who in the earliest ages had shaved for purity, now grew their hair in subtle styles, curling and perfuming it in ways that honored the ancient gods of fertility and rebirth. In the court of the later pharaohs, hair became language, its texture, its curl, its adornment all whispering secrets of status and faith. The wig makers, inheritors of centuries of craft, became custodians of these unspoken codes. Their workshops were half sanctuaries, half laboratories, filled with the scent of oils and the soft rustle of fibers. They sorted human hair collected from barbers, temple attendants, and even the remnants of mummies unearthed for their strands, though this last act was whispered of more than admitted. The wigs they crafted were living symbols of resurrection, hair once lost, reborn in new form. Each strand was carefully aligned in the direction of Ra's daily journey, so that the wearer's aura would follow the sun's path. And within the intricate weaving lay hidden charms, small faience beads shaped like the eye of Horus, shells invoking the Nile's fertility, or gold wires that shimmered like captured sunlight. As the centuries deepened, the Egyptians began to see hair as a dual symbol, life and death, vanity and eternity, the mortal husk and the undying soul. It was said that the goddess Isis, in mourning for Osiris, tore her hair and scattered it across the Nile, where it became the papyrus reeds that line the riverbanks. Thus every strand of hair was, in some mythic sense, a remnant of divine sorrow. To cut it was to imitate her act of sacred grief, to participate in cosmic lamentation. The priestesses of Isis wore their hair unbound during funerary rites, letting it flow like the river of time, its disarray a visible prayer for rebirth. Even today, in the fragments of their papyri, one finds hymns that speak of this gesture, how the unbinding of hair called forth the wind of renewal, how it carried the soul's cry to the horizon. But in the darker corners of Egyptian belief, there was also fear. The same hair that bound the self to eternity could bind it to shadow. Curses were woven through locks stolen or discarded. Sorcerers were said to trap the ka, the vital essence, of a person by binding their hair with knots and sealing them in clay figures. The Egyptians believed that the body's fragments were extensions of the soul, and thus even a single strand could serve as a vessel for magic. The most secret rituals of protection involved burning one's fallen hair in sacred fire, lest it be found and used against you. To lose hair carelessly was to court misfortune, to cut it without prayer was to risk imbalance. And so, every trimming was accompanied by murmured incantations, half-whispered acknowledgments to the gods of continuity. This delicate balance between reverence and fear marked the Egyptian psyche in profound ways. Their world was a web of correspondences, every visible thing had an unseen twin, every mundane act carried cosmic weight. To wash, to anoint, to comb, these were not trivial acts but small rituals in the grand dance of harmony. Even the fragrance of the oils mattered, for each scent was a note in the divine music of the world. The oil of lotus soothed the spirit, aligning it with the calm of the Nile. The oil of cedar guarded against decay, recalling the forests of Lebanon where the gods once walked. The oil of myrrh carried the breath of eternity, used both for the living and the embalmed. In their use of such substances, Egyptians blurred the line between the temple and the home, between priest and commoner. And yet, in that blurring, a subtle unease took root. The closer one came to perfect order, the more fragile it became. A single stray hair, a missed ritual, could call attention to mortality. The more they adorned themselves with wigs that imitated divine perfection, the more acutely they must have felt their impermanence beneath. The razor, the comb, the oil, all these were gestures of control against the creeping truth that time unravels every braid, that the dust reclaims even the purest scalp. To be Egyptian was to live in negotiation with eternity, to prepare daily for death, and through that preparation, to assert life's luminous defiance. And so they polished their mirrors until they could see the sun within them, brushed their wigs until they glowed like obsidian, perfumed themselves as though each day were both an ending and a beginning. The wig of the priestess, the beard of the pharaoh, the plait of the child, all became threads in a vast tapestry of order. But beneath this outward serenity lay the haunting thought that perhaps the gods, too, wore wigs of illusion, their perfection only a reflection of human yearning. In the flicker of the oil lamp, one might imagine the divine locks shimmering, the universe itself a carefully arranged hairpiece over the bald truth of nothingness. And yet, the Egyptians did not fear that void, they adorned it, scented it, gave it form. They tamed eternity by grooming it. Thus, in the quiet hours of their civilization's twilight, as foreign kings ruled from their palaces and the old gods whispered from forgotten shrines, the rituals of hair endured. Even as temples fell, the combs remained, the oils still glowed faintly in their jars, and the murals preserved forever the image of a woman before her mirror, serene, composed, eternal. It is through her, perhaps, that Egypt still dreams, her wig perfect, her gaze calm, her silence filled with the hum of cosmic order. The wind passes over the desert as it once passed through her hair, carrying with it the faintest trace of myrrh, the faintest echo of a razor's song, the endless rhythm of purification that once made men feel close to gods. In the fading shimmer of late afternoon, when the Nile turns to a slow mirror of bronze and the horizon blurs into sleep, the last strand of an ancient meditation, the quiet unraveling of a civilization's self-reflection. By this time in Egypt's long story, the art of hair and wig had reached its most intricate expression, an intersection of beauty, power, and metaphysics so refined that even the simplest gesture, a hand adjusting a braid, a priest smoothing a lock before a ceremony, felt like an act of prayer. For what the Egyptians had learned, after centuries of polishing their rituals to a luminous stillness, was that control over appearance was a kind of control over existence itself. They had mastered the illusion that eternity could be maintained strand by strand, that the decay of the body could be delayed through the precision of form. Yet beneath this devotion, there was an awareness too quiet to name, that all perfection is built on the edge of fragility, and that the most carefully arranged hair would one day scatter as dust upon the desert wind. The temple archives spoke of it in metaphors, the priests of Thoth describing the cosmos as a head of divine hair endlessly combed by Ma'at, the goddess of truth, who prevents its tangling through her eternal vigilance. In this vision, every star was a shining strand, every current of the Nile a ripple in the celestial main. When drought struck, it was said that the gods had neglected their combs, that the cosmic hair had matted with disorder. Rituals were performed to restore this order, with priests shaving their heads anew, the razors glinting beneath the sun as if to mimic the restoration of divine smoothness. They would anoint their scalps with sacred oils, their reflections trembling upon the temple's polished floors. The act was both symbolic and intimate, a merging of the human and the heavenly through the humble rhythm of grooming. And as the oil ran down their temples, cool and fragrant, one might imagine they felt, however briefly, the illusion of infinite balance. But beyond the walls of the temple, in the humbler dwellings of Memphis and Thebes, hair continued to hold its strange duality, practical and mystical, domestic and sacred. Mothers still whispered charms as they combed their daughters' hair, each stroke a ward against sickness and sorrow. Men still perfumed their wigs for banquets, for the Egyptians believed that fragrance itself pleased the soul, that the scent of lotus or myrrh could keep decay at bay. The aristocrats of the New Kingdom wore layered wigs that cascaded over their shoulders like midnight water, their curls meticulously patterned into small waves that caught the lamplight. Beneath these elaborate creations, their real scalps were clean-shaven, an emptiness concealed by abundance, a paradox that seemed to please the Egyptian mind. What mattered was not what was real but what was ordered, not what grew but what endured. To wear a wig was to wear eternity, and in doing so, to defy the disorder of time. In the workshops of wig makers, this defiance took form through patience. The artisans, sitting in narrow courtyards, sorted strands by length and texture, humming old hymns as they worked. Some mixed human hair with threads of gold or bronze wire, believing metal lent permanence to the weave. Others softened palm fiber in oils until it could mimic the pliancy of flesh. When they worked for royalty, the results were almost supernatural, wigs that shimmered with a sheen that seemed neither human nor divine, suspended between both worlds. One can almost picture a craftsman lifting a finished piece into the sun, watching the light pass through its layered curls, knowing that he has made something that will accompany a soul into the afterlife. For the Egyptians, hair was among the few things they could control against the unknowable. The crops might fail, the river might rise or retreat, the gods might fall silent, but a wig, properly crafted, could last thousands of years, surviving tomb collapses, fires, and dynastic shifts. In that persistence, there was comfort. And yet, there was also superstition. The same hair that brought beauty could bring misfortune if left unattended. Stray hairs were burned in small clay dishes, accompanied by murmured phrases to prevent one's shadow from being captured. The concept of shadow, the shut, was bound to the body like an invisible twin, and hair was thought to be one of its physical anchors. To discard it thoughtlessly was to leave one's soul exposed. Even in death, this belief persisted. Embalmers treated the hair of the deceased with oils and resins, wrapping it separately from the face, preserving it as carefully as the heart or the eyes. To lose one's hair in the tomb was a tragedy, for it meant to enter eternity incomplete. Thus, in the necropolises where thousands of silent figures waited for rebirth, hair and wigs were carefully arrayed beside canopic jars, perfumed cones, and jewelry, forming part of the great architecture of continuity. For the Egyptians, hair was a symbol of resurrection because it continued to grow after death, an illusion, perhaps, born of the desiccation process, but one that held deep resonance. To them, it proved that life persisted beneath the veil of stillness. And so hair became a metaphor for the cyclical renewal of all things, the daily rebirth of the sun, the annual flooding of the Nile, the eternal return of the soul. When a priest shaved his head for purification, it was not an act of denial but preparation for new growth. Each morning's ritual was a rehearsal for the journey beyond life, each comb stroke a renewal of cosmic rhythm. There is something almost unbearably tender in this, an entire civilization finding divinity in the simplest gestures, in the human need to cleanse, to adorn, to preserve. They transformed grooming into theology, the vanity of the flesh into the language of the eternal. And still, the undercurrent of unease ran through it all. The Egyptians understood that beauty was a mask, a fragile surface upon which the truth of decay was painted. They did not shy away from this knowledge, they honored it, shaped it, adorned it. To them, every wig was both shield and confession, every oil jar both cosmetic and funerary. The same hands that combed a child's hair in life might one day anoint her mummified scalp, repeating the motions that had always bound love to order. Time, they seemed to know, was itself a comb, endlessly smoothing the tangled fibers of existence, sometimes gently, sometimes mercilessly. And so, as their civilization waned, as the Ptolemies rose and the Roman eagles cast their shadows over the temples, the rituals continued in quiet defiance. The last priestesses of Isis still wore their long wigs perfumed with lotus oil, still let their hair fall loose in mourning for Osiris. The last barbers still sharpened their blades with reverence, still whispered the old phrases before the cut. Even as foreign gods took residence in their shrines, the Egyptians clung to their sacred gestures. To keep the hair in order was to keep the world intact, to resist the encroaching chaos that came not only from conquest but from mortality itself. And perhaps, as we look back through the long corridor of centuries, we can sense in their devotion a kind of melancholy wisdom. The Egyptians knew that the sacred is fragile, that perfection is an illusion constantly threatened by the ordinary. Their response was not to despair but to ritualize the ordinary until it shimmered with eternity. They made the razor a holy thing, the comb a symbol of cosmic order, the wig a bridge between the living and the divine. And in this, there is something profoundly human, a yearning to find meaning in care, to make the transient eternal by the grace of attention. Even now, in museums where their wigs rest beneath glass, the curls still gleam faintly, the oils long dried but their order intact. They have survived the ruin of empires, the collapse of belief, the erosion of meaning. Their silence is their lesson. In the perfection of their arrangement, we glimpse not vanity but faith, a faith that the human form, tended with devotion, could touch eternity. And if one listens closely, in the hum of the museum air, one might almost hear it, the faint rustle of strands brushing together, the whisper of a comb passing through ancient hair, the echo of a prayer once spoken under desert stars. The Egyptians are gone, but their rituals remain, still smoothing, still shining, still holding back the night, one strand at a time. In the dim hush of eternity, where the Nile's memory drifts beyond the veil of centuries, the story draws itself inward, like a final breath before sleep, the epilogue, where silence becomes the truest historian. The sands of Egypt have long since covered the houses where barbers murmured their quiet prayers, the temples where priests shaved their heads in the morning sun, the workshops where wigmakers twisted strands of hair into shapes that mirrored the eternal order. And yet, something of them lingers, something softer than the touch of oil upon skin, a fragrance of devotion, a rhythm of ritual that has never truly ceased. For what the Egyptians learned in their long communion with the mirror was not merely how to adorn the body, but how to make beauty itself a vessel for the divine. The air above the ruins of Karnak still shivers with this secret. In the dusk, when the last light brushes against the columns and the first stars tremble in the eastern sky, one can almost see it, the shimmer of something invisible, a ripple that hums with ancient precision. Perhaps it is only dust caught in the air. Or perhaps it is the faint remembrance of the thousands of combs that once moved in unison through the hair of a civilization. The Egyptians had understood that every ritual, however small, was an imitation of cosmic order. To arrange one's hair was to restore ma'at, the principle of balance. To anoint one's scalp with oil was to summon the essence of the sun. To wear a wig was to stand, if only for a moment, in the still perfection of the gods. Every gesture was a conversation with eternity, and in that conversation, the Egyptians found solace. But time, that patient unraveler, has always been both witness and thief. The priests who shaved themselves smooth are gone. Their razors are rust, their mirrors dulled. The wigs that once shone like black water now sleep in the cool darkness of museums, their curls frozen in an endless pause between being and forgetting. And yet, the deeper one looks upon them, the more they seem to whisper. Their stillness is not absence but presence, an echo of belief so profound that even silence has learned to speak it. The Egyptians had built their eternity upon the smallest of things, a comb's tooth, a strand of hair, a drop of scented oil. Through these fragile conduits, they tried to hold the infinite in their hands. And in some strange way, they succeeded. Consider the mummified heads that rest beneath glass in the museum vaults. Their features, long ago dried by desert air and resin, still retain traces of the living. The hair, dark, coiled, and glistening faintly with the remnants of ancient unguents, seems impossibly alive. It is as though the body has forgotten the centuries while the hair remembers. It remembers the hum of the Nile at dusk, the scent of lotus drifting through the courtyards, the slow movement of a comb through perfumed curls. It remembers touch, the gentle patience of hands that believed tending to beauty was a sacred duty. In that memory, we glimpse the Egyptian secret, that eternity was never found in the grand gesture, but in the repetition of care. Each day, they enacted creation anew through cleanliness, order, adornment. They made life a liturgy. To shave the head, to weave a wig, to perfume a strand, these were small acts of rebellion against decay. They were affirmations of form against formlessness, of being against the void. In every polished mirror, they saw not their reflection but the order of the universe, Ra's daily rebirth mirrored in their own renewal. They believed that the gods combed their hair as the stars crossed the night sky, that the sun itself was a shining disk of divine hair burning with perpetual vitality. To live, then, was to imitate that celestial grooming, to keep oneself aligned with the rhythm of the cosmos. And in this imitation, they found meaning deeper than philosophy, quieter than prayer. But even for them, there must have been moments of doubt. Imagine the high priest, late in the evening, the temple silent around him, his scalp still faintly warm from the razor's edge. He looks into the polished bronze mirror, sees his face illuminated by the flicker of a single oil lamp, and for a moment wonders what will remain when the rituals are over. Does the act itself preserve eternity, or merely delay its loss? The question lingers like the scent of resin, sweet, heavy, unanswerable. For all their faith, the Egyptians were human, and their rituals were built upon the same fragile longing that haunts every age, the desire to remain. And so they made eternity tangible. The wig became a crown of defiance, the oil a spell against impermanence. They knew the body would perish, but they hoped the image, the ordered, adorned, perfected image, would endure. The tomb paintings show them forever young, their wigs immaculate, their faces serene beneath layers of pigment and time. These were not portraits of vanity, but affirmations of cosmic alignment. In eternity, nothing decays, nothing falters. The hair never tangles, the oil never dries, the skin never cracks beneath the sun. It is the dream of unchanging form, suspended between the real and the divine. We, too, are haunted by that same dream. Though the temples are gone and the hymns forgotten, the rituals of hair and adornment persist. Every morning, across the modern world, hands reach for combs, mirrors, oils. The gestures are the same, the motions unchanged. We smooth what is unruly, conceal what is imperfect, seek to hold back the tide of time with small, rhythmic acts. We do not name it as they did, we no longer call upon Hathor or Ra, but the impulse is the same, to create order upon the body, to make beauty a sanctuary against oblivion. The Egyptians would recognize us in this. They would see that their faith, though veiled in new words and mirrors, continues still in the quiet of our mornings. And yet, if one listens closely to the silence of a museum, or to the whisper of wind through papyrus reeds at dusk, one might sense another truth hidden beneath that devotion. The Egyptians were not merely adorning themselves against death, they were conversing with it. Each comb stroke, each anointing, was an acknowledgement of transience, a tender acceptance of what would come. Their perfection was not denial but dialogue. They invited death into their rituals, made it a companion rather than an enemy. To prepare the body for beauty was also to prepare it for burial. The same oils used to perfume the living perfumed the dead. The same razors that shaved the priests cleansed the corpses. The boundary between worship and farewell was as thin as the sheen of oil upon skin. And so, in their devotion, there was peace. They did not seek to escape decay but to transform it, to make it part of the pattern, to fold impermanence into eternity's design. In this lies the strange calm that still clings to their art, the serenity of faces long gone yet still composed, the stillness of wigs that outlasted dynasties. Their silence is not haunting but soothing, as though they have already made their peace with time. When we gaze upon them, it is we who feel the unease of impermanence, not they. For they have become what they sought, order embodied, harmony preserved, the infinite combing itself smooth. And yet there remains one last question, hovering like incense over the ruins: did they ever tire of their perfection? Did they ever long to let their hair grow wild, to feel the disorder they feared? Perhaps somewhere, among the endless tombs and scrolls, there was one soul who did. Perhaps a priest who, weary of the razor's edge, let his hair grow in secret beneath his wig, a hidden rebellion against eternity. Or a woman who, one night, unbound her braids and left them loose in the wind, feeling for a moment not divine but alive. If so, then she, too, was part of Ma'at's balance, for order must know disorder to mean anything at all. The sands whisper such possibilities. They carry the echoes of countless lives, some obedient to ritual, some defiant, all now equal beneath the desert's weight. But their gestures remain, the care, the grace, the devotion. In every preserved curl and painted braid lies the same yearning, to find peace in repetition, meaning in beauty, immortality in care. The Egyptians turned these small gestures into eternity, and eternity, in turn, has preserved them. Now, as night gathers over the Nile's ghostly banks, the desert cools, and the constellations rise like jeweled combs in the sky. The stars align as they once did over Thebes and Memphis, each one a spark in the divine hair of the heavens. Somewhere in that stillness, the old gods sleep, their wigs untouched by time, their faces serene as polished stone. And the wind moves softly through the ruins, through the temples and tombs, through the hollows where incense once burned, carrying with it the faintest murmur of centuries, the sound of a comb through unseen hair, the sigh of a civilization at peace with its own vanishing. This is what remains, not the razors, not the oils, not even the names of those who held them, but the rhythm of care, the art of tending to what must fade. It is the gentlest defiance, the quietest form of prayer. And in the stillness, when all else has dissolved into sand, one truth endures, whispered by the endless Egyptian night, that beauty, when made sacred, never truly dies. It only changes form, moving from hair to starlight, from hand to memory, from ritual to dream, combed forever through the silent expanse of eternity.